Panel number 2, Translating Aging Research, Bottlenecks and the Role of Venture Philanthropy and Family Offices panel. This is something that's not in my wheelhouse, so I'm a scientist, but I think we have plenty of people with finance background here to give me a boost. So the goal of this panel, just to sum it up, it's to give you, the audience, and myself, an understanding of the progress and trends in translating aging research. So we're going to discuss key players like venture philanthropy funds, family offices, and other funding sources that can be pioneers in this respect. So I'm going to start out with just the first question that I'm going to toss to our panelists, and that is basically, how do venture philanthropy funds, family offices, and other non-traditional funding sources play a role in the aging translational science ecosystem? So I think I'm going to take it maybe from my left, and we'll move on to the right, unless somebody wants to jump in.
We'll jump in. So there's a few things that are just very exciting in terms of progress, but the short version is there's a lot of both on the philanthropy side and the family office side and other sources of capital that are interested in, that are already invested in the research and different components, but are not traditionally invested on the company side. And those end up being some of the sources of, from the venture capital side, LPs, right? So funds of funds, sort of the money behind the money for enabling more of these very early stage strategies like ours, right? So some of our LPs, essentially, that's the makeup of our investors are other successful founders, family offices, entrepreneurs that understand the challenge. We're all invested in some capacity on the philanthropic side, but there's this gap for funding on the early stage side. So that's sort of one area. Another area is the advent of donor advised funds, right? So enabling through what would traditionally be philanthropy to donate essentially this kind of that capital in what would essentially operate as a fund, which would then fund some of the companies. And that's very early stage in terms of the discussion, which I think we can kind of deep dive a little bit on. The opportunity that we're seeing here in New York, so our fund has kind of presence between the Valley and here, but I'm personally here and operate more closely on the family office side as well, so we can deep dive a little bit more then.
So this isn't my primary wheelhouse either, but what I've also noticed in my preliminary dealings with this kind of space is there's also a knowledge gap here, with certain donor-advised funds or family trusts. A family trust might have a certain amount of money earmarked going to just, college X or whatever. People that would be interested in giving to aging research focus instead of just, a general university or a general topic, but don't really know that there's anything to give money to in this space. So I think there's also an important job of finding out what those connection points are, educating these trusts and these people that this is a viable avenue to be putting those dollars.
I would start out by saying that similar to doing science, investing in early stage science is not an easy game. The most successful early stage investors in biotech are exclusively scientists or successful biotech entrepreneurs that have deep, deep, deep exposure to science. So we deal at Apollo with a number of family offices, and my advice to all of them is that the outreach that we do and the guys like Oliver and Keith have done with Leaf is fantastic because it riles people up, it gets them really excited about the field, and Aubrey, I think that you're very responsible for a big piece of that as well. But then when we think about the commercialization and translation of this, my advice to those families, and perhaps I have a bias since I run a venture fund, it is to funnel those resources through a group of scientists who manage that investment, right? And I guess that's kind of where the three of us sit on this panel. In regards to the second piece of this, which is venture philanthropy, I think that that's actually quite a different issue because certain philanthropic groups, and I think that the best example of this is the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, have become highly, highly specialized and competent, scientifically driven investors in the space that have created huge amounts of value. So if you look at the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, they've actually generated, just for the foundation, I think between $250 million and $500 million in returns from a few early stage investments that they made that other Boston and San Francisco investors wouldn't make in early cystic fibrosis assets that really worked out. The difference there is that they created a team of academic advisors and former entrepreneurs to do the actual investment work. It wasn't just part of our charitable pocket, so let's give it to cystic fibrosis and a company instead of a foundation. Anyway.
Well, investing is a really inefficient business. People can't understand everything, and mostly people who make a lot of money understand some really specific domain that helped them make the money and not the things that their values may be attached to, which is helping people live longer or their grandchildren live longer with less disease. And it's not like in public companies where all the information or a lot of information about the company is disclosed in a very organized way to the whole marketplace who can evaluate it based on criteria or whatever. It's this sort of really inefficient network of friends and friends of friends and people who trust each other, and there's a lot of BS and people who are trying to sell you. And there are other people who you've known for 10 years and you know they're not trying to sell you and they're really telling you what they believe, but then do they really understand the science? And it's this, hopefully someday it'll all be taken over by AI and it'll just be perfectly efficient. But right now it's just like friend to friend and person to person. So it's really important to build these networks, to build trust, to communicate as much as you know and let people know you're scientific. And I completely agree with you about understanding the science. It is a scientific thing. It's not like in software investing where if you invest in some CEO with a lot of charisma and there's a self-referential property where that charisma will actually create success for the company. What the KD of some particular protein to protein binding constant is not going to be affected by the CEO's charisma. So these people really have to understand the science and be realistic about it at the same time they're ambitious. So I guess breaking this down into two halves, like the way I relate to investing is having built companies, knowing VCs. VCs often ask me to help them due diligence because who are they going to ask? It's this inefficient network of people who trust people. So I go in and look at companies for them and try to understand the science and tell them best I know. A bunch of my personal investing has been a result of that, going into a company and saying, holy crap, this is actually really good. Can I invest alongside you? For instance, I did StemCentrics that way, which had a really nice exit recently. And then also just like through people I know and people I trust. I've also tried to raise money for charities, for nonprofits. It's like extremely hard. It's like a factor of 100 different. This like something that's really, really important. You go talk to people about it and say you should really contribute money to this. And they're like, yeah, okay, maybe I'll give a couple $1,000s there. Versus, hey, I have this venture that's actually less important to society, but it's possibly likely to make you money. And they're like, great, where do I write you a $10 million check? What? So I think that there's a growing trend of doing things, what people are calling impact investing, where there's some deep value you have in it, and there's at least some prospect of making money back from it that checks some sort of mental binary checkbox where you're saying, okay, I'm being responsible with my funds, and it feels good. Right now I'm the board chair for an organization I'm excited about called the Longevity Research Institute that touches one of the areas that I continue to feel needs help and is broken, which is the animal side. And they're getting a bunch of 7-figure investment on the nonprofit side for going through and repeating all the animal experiments in longevity as something where you don't really imagine for-profit investors kind of doing that. And yet it's probably going to reveal some molecules that should be followed up in a for-profit way. So there's a hybrid model happening there.
I'd completely agree. So certainly what we see in London is a bit of a disaster around high net worths that are, like you say, talking to their network and talking to their friends and not necessarily putting their money into quite the right ventures. Whereas if you can go through some kind of network that really does deeply understand the science, that's undoubtedly the way to do it. But I'll go a step further to say that I don't know the Silicon Valley scene, but certainly in Europe there's a real dearth of really high quality startups, especially in this space. And what we're trying to do to solve that is fill in that gap and bring people together like Bobby earlier with the scientists to take a more strategic view of what the opportunities are and then bring people together to address those opportunities rather than just push forward the research, which is often, as someone Aubrey said himself, is a mission to understand what is there rather than necessarily to find the right thing to translate. So my personal opinion, there's a big gap there, and high net worth angel-style funding in that gap is really important.
Yeah, certainly the role of angel investors is absolutely pivotal right now. And well, I specifically mean, investors who are able to act unilaterally, and also who are comfortable with really, high risk, high reward activities. But absolutely, it's true, what everyone has been saying, that if you're not a specialist in this area, then you damn well better be advised by somebody who is, in order to decide where your money should go. Essentially, either employ or delegate to somebody who, or people who know what they're talking about. And so in my world right now, I see that in a variety of ways. There are people who just come to me and my team at Sense to ask for advice, and they, to the extent that they take that advice, they invest well. But there are also people who prefer to just delegate in a more concrete way by essentially investing in another fund. So, for example, the very first venture fund that was set up specifically to focus on this field, which was, of course, Laura Deming's longevity fund, that has recently received a $3 million donation from a group that we also talk to, and who've given us money philanthropically, but in order to make their decisions, rather than just trying to build up in-house expertise or just ask us every time they want to make a decision, they decided to just let Laura do it. And I'm totally fine with that. I think the delegating in that way is the right way to go. I will, however, also say something about the intersection and the interaction between the investing side and the philanthropic side, which has become very apparent over the past couple of years. When we talk to people who are investors first and owners second, as the sort that Joe was talking about, we try to persuade them, obviously, to be donors as well as investors. And our main argument is that's how you're going to get access. That's how you're going to be able to come and visit our labs and talk to us whenever you like. And you're going to have the information that will let you be the lead initial investor in the next startup that we spin out or whatever. And I'm pleased to say that that argument is actually reasonably successful. A reasonably high proportion of the people who come to us for investment advice will also turn into significant donors as a result of essentially buying that argument. So yes, the intersection between these two things is extremely important. As I said in my own remarks this morning, the non-profit side of things is going to remain the absolutely indispensable engine room of the industry for some time to come. And therefore, it's very good news that the more edgy, high-risk, high-reward friendly people with deep pockets are willing to put their feet in both camps.
Okay, thank you, Aubrey. So kind of bouncing off what you mentioned earlier, James, about Parkinson's disease and that model. Cystic fibrosis. Looking at other deep tech and scientific fields, what can we learn, basically, when it comes to, which other fields have done a good job of building translational pipelines and ecosystems that basically we can model, so without reinventing the wheel, model, the same kind of network and ecosystem in the aging sector?
Okay, I guess I can jump in first. So my view here is not to dodge the question, but I don't think we need to reinvent anything. The magic of the aging system as an investment target right now, and the reason that we have seen this step change in the way that we talk about longevity and aging and gerontoscience in the last 4 or 5 years, is that 5 years ago, we needed an answer to that question. What do we do with all of these aging things that we know extend lifespan, but we don't know what to do with them? Now we have a different answer for it, which is from a biopharma strategy perspective. If you are a biotech company and you have an aging drug, something that slows down or reverses a piece of the aging process, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You just need to follow in the footsteps of existing biopharma companies, drug companies that are making drugs for cancer or Parkinson's or heart disease or whatever it is. And then the magic, and I want to just tell a brief anecdote here, the magic is that once you do that one thing well, it will have so many knock-on effects because you're doing something affecting the underlying biology of aging that you then expand and expand. So there was a key decision that came out of the FDA this year for a cancer drug called Keytruda. And what Keytruda is I don't know if you guys have heard this term, it's immuno-oncology, right? It's activating the immune system to kill cancer. And they started with melanoma and showed that this drug could help the immune system kill melanoma cells. Then they showed it for another cancer type and another cancer type. And eventually the FDA threw up their hands and said, okay, any cancer that has this specific marker showing that Keytruda will bind to it, you can use Keytruda for. That model is so key to our field in aging, because if we show something that prevents heart attacks and prevents strokes and prevents onset of diabetes, then they'll be like, okay, just give it to everybody.
Yeah, I actually want to jump in next because I want to follow up on something James said about the FDA. So the FDA is often seen as the bad guy in all of this, you know, as the people who hold back the regulatory process and cause a lot of people to die because they can't get drugs quickly enough. But I think that's unfair. I think that the FDA, first of all, they're in a very difficult position, of course, in general. You know, they have to, they're an arm of the government. But the fact is, they are really reflecting public opinion. When we look at the impact of, you know, one person dying in a clinical trial or dying from an approved drug, it can be absolutely enormous. And, you know, I mean, gene therapy is a great example. The famous story of Jesse Gelsinger, whose death basically held back clinical trials in gene therapy worldwide for well over a year. It was ridiculous. Whereas, you know, lots of people dying because they can't get hold of a drug doesn't make the headlines. But the thing about the FDA that is another advance that I actually thought was the one that James was going to mention, but was not this year, it was last year, is that they now, for practical purposes, regard aging as a clinical condition that you can have a drug for. This is the result of an enormously laborious and long-drawn-out discussion between the FDA and a handful of senior gerontologists, where basically they ironed out a kind of way of describing aging without using the word aging. Essentially describing an endpoint that was very multifactorial and incorporated the integration and interaction between components of aging in the required way. And the result is that a clinical trial is now approved, though it's not happening yet because it hasn't been fully funded, for testing metformin for aging. Now, metformin is, you know, probably not going to do much good anyway, and even if it does, it's not going to make anyone any money because it's been off patent since before your mother was born. But the fact is, the principle is enormous. It means that whenever anyone wants to come along and actually have a clinical trial against aging for something that they could make money out of, then the template exists now for how you define the endpoint of the clinical trial. And, you know, 5 years ago, no one would ever have believed that that would have happened. The impact on the industry, I believe, is going to be huge because it means that there is no longer this chilling effect on the vested interests of big pharma and the medical industry with regard to the investment that's required to get a drug that far in the first place. And so this is another example, I feel, where 5 years ago we definitely had some reinventing to do, but now we just need to do what's already in place.
So, I mean, basically, I have a question here, you know, and it says, thoughts on how we can speed up the translation of aging technologies. So, am I hearing this correctly, that we are on track? There's nothing else that we can do to kind of... Always go faster. Is there one thing we can do to go much faster?
I mean, the poster children for taking age-related diseases, of which I'd consider heart disease and cancer, to be, and getting a whole pipeline of therapeutics moving out for them is biomarkers. And, you know, heart disease has benefited from high blood pressure and cholesterol and things like this that have somehow magically been approved as proxies for the actual disease. And they're quick to measure, and they're rapid to change in the physiology of people. So you give them a drug, their cholesterol goes down, and that's the victory. And you can immediately start marketing that drug. And in cancer, you know, it's a much more short-term approach also. Will this tumor shrink in size? It's not what I would consider to be the actual aging angle of cancer. And cancer is probably the hugest age-related disease that we have, what would actually be attacking cancer from an aging perspective would be preventing it from happening in the first place. And virtually no one is doing this, unfortunately. But looking at cancer as a poster child for how do you make like an industry happen, you have all these biomarkers, tumor size, 5-year survival rate, things that you can actually measure in trials. So to be tremendously successful at the largest killer of all, which is aging, what we need to accelerate that are having more and better biomarkers, things that would be accepted by, it's not just the FDA, it's really the bogeyman is payers. Who will reimburse for what? Because people, ordinary people only have so much money, and if you go to Blue Shield and say, I want to take this drug and I want you to pay for it and it's going to slow down my aging, they will just laugh at you. And so that will not happen. But what we need are biomarkers such that there's something you can measure in blood that is predictive of whether you're going to die or not, or whether you're going to become frail, or whether you're going to develop cancer or heart disease or NASH and so on. And we're starting to get the glimmers of the first few ones of these, but I think that is one of the largest challenges, and I think should be projects of this community and this industry.
Just to jump in, just really briefly off of that, because you mentioned cholesterol, which I think is one of the key analogs that we have to think about when we're thinking about making a drug that is preventing disease. The road to establishing cholesterol as a biomarker such that it could replace clinical endpoints like mortality or heart attack endpoints in clinical trials was a 30-plus year process, right? That started in the 1960s and culminated at the end of the 1990s when those trials were going on, and Lipitor, the first statin, was ultimately approved in the early 2000s. The seminal challenge from a regulatory perspective for people in this industry and also the FDA is to see how we can use the enormous amount of data that we will have on potential biomarkers for aging to shorten that window that was 30 years, 20 years ago, I guess 20 to 50 years ago, but should be able to be accomplished in a much shorter time frame now. That is to me the key bottleneck in getting this approved so we all take a pill to live longer.
Yeah, I actually kind of want to piggyback on that same point in that, I think there are lessons to learn from other fields and other industries. So the one in my mind, because that's my background, is computer science, computer programming, and sort of a systems analysis to, from a high level, analyze, what are the lacks in the field, what are the key bottlenecks, and biomarkers is going to be one that I was going to bring up, and also a problem of reproducibility that's in some sense trying to be attacked by the ITP program, I can't say this word, parallelizing trials multiple times in different labs to verify that the results are accurate, to analyze what are the things that slow down or can derail progress, and then restructure your systems approach to incorporate that. So I think, for example, biomarkers, if you don't have good metrics to test your results in a timely manner, you're going to be kind of floundering around for 20 years. So you really need to have those target points so you can say, this works, this doesn't, how do we proceed in a smart way?
Yeah, I'd add just increasing that collective intelligence. So a few of the slides we've seen today have really rammed that home. One is that picture of posters, just posters that are changed every hour or so. Is that really the best way to be sharing information and creating that kind of graph? The point is creating that network of intelligence that is across all researchers rather than just these utterly siloed bases which are shared in a few papers. We just haven't got the mental capacity to understand these systems in full, and it's going to be a plateau until we can really do that.
Just as a funny quick story, I remember when I was in college, after, as a culmination of my math program, I actually did my thesis with the bioengineering department. And as a computer programmer, when I was first using like BLAST and sequence analysis programs, I was like shocked at the crudity of the tools that were available in the biotechnology field. And I was like, okay, that's, to me, it also opens up a value of interdisciplinariness, right? I think we need a lot more computer programmers and mathematicians also jumping in to work with, pipetter researchers to really analyze how can we move things along in a fast way.
Just the only thing I wanted to add in terms of accelerating is that just even a few years ago, some of the funds and opportunities that kind of we all represent or know now didn't really even exist. So So I'm echoing James on my bias here in terms of deploying capital to the funds that have had, and also to individuals that have had success in the space, right, and can put that capital to work in the founders that already demonstrated that they can do the work. And the fact that we all sort of know each other and somebody can reference, there's somebody out of Europe and there's an early team, and we can say, hey, have you heard about this team or this fund or that fund? It's a step change, and we can do that on the LP side as well, right? So we can kind of share that because there's more than enough capital out there for all kinds of funds, all kinds of strategies, and kind of working together so that that trust within those networks and those ecosystems continue to grow is sort of one thing that we can all kind of do together.
So you actually had an answer to the question I was about to ask, James, which was biomarkers and exactly how they can speed up research, which is getting them to be, put into the translational pipeline and accepted as a biomarker by the FDA, and how long that would take. And if we can crunch that time down, then that would be a significant step forward. Shifting gears a little bit, so talking about other investors, universities, they often own a lot of IP from research, lots of IP. How can they be a value add to the aging translational ecosystem? I'm not familiar with this term, value add. I'm come from the sciences, but so if you can explain value add, I guess that somebody wrote that in there. So I guess how can they be important to the aging translational ecosystem?
Well, the tech licensing offices at universities tend to be very small, understaffed, responsible for understanding a massive range of technologies from plasma physics to stem cell biology to so it's hard for them to really add value, and the whole IP department is structured around how do we arbitrage some sort of value that we're paying for patent attorneys, and how can we get the money back and maybe put some more money in the endowment for the university. And they're not really an organized way of trying to change the world and move things in the right direction. They're just trying to survive. That said, my experience so far with most of the TLOs at universities is that they're pretty cooperative if the PI is into it. If the professor really likes the particular postdoc or grad student wants to start a company, or if the professor wants to be an advisor, and the TLO will just say, well, you're the one who knows about this, and you're sort of a hallowed class here at the university. You're one of these rare, super brilliant minds that we spend so much effort recruiting. Then we trust you and go for it. And generally, they tend to be fairly cooperative. I mean, some universities are more sticklers than others and annoying, but by and large, they're like reasonably standard cookie cutter terms that aren't that binding or restricting to startup companies that want to take something forward. So it generally doesn't seem to be too much of a problem. Not much value add, but not much value subtract either.
Yeah, this is definitely an area, a big sort of peeve of mine. I mean, I'm an engineer, entrepreneur first, but I'm also kind of IP lawyer, so I've been bashing TLOs, and one is collectively pushing for a shift in the way they think about, right? Echoing kind of what you just said, in terms of instead of saying, hey, let's sort of extract some kind of random value that we don't even know because we haven't even started, to more the Cornell Tech model, where it's really the AP goes to the researcher, the institution gets recognized, an equity stake in the potential future company, and then we can all just go and see if, we'll still go to zero if we invest, right? But really shifting that. And university ecosystems, some of them are understanding that that's the right approach, and really going from their endowment to have exposure to the funds as well, right? Like University of Chicago, having their innovation funds, and, doing, on-cap notes to companies that are spinning out just to really fund them. The new MIT engine kind of funds that also. So it's really for all of us to target kind of behind the TLO, right? Really go all the way to the top, which we all kind of have access in different ways to support them, right? And kind of explain that the value is captured on the exit, not on the negotiation of the license up front, where we're just trying to get it out the door so that we can really help them.
Let me answer Oliver's question really quick. What is value add will be my only contribution to this piece. So from it's a finance and investor term, right? So when you start a company, that company has a certain value. Let's say it's $5 million, and we put some money in, and that company, after we put the money in, is worth $5 million. Whatever you do between day zero, when that company is worth $5 million, and then a year from now, when you raise some more money into that company and you have to decide with some other investors what the company's now worth, hopefully every activity that you've done is adding value to the company. So now that when you raise money the next year, it's worth 10 million instead of 5, something like that, right? So a year of your and your team's work was now worth 5 million. Hopefully that makes sense to those non-finance, non-venture folks in the audience.
So I used to work in Imperial's TTO, which is supposed to be the sort of flagship of the UK's TTOs. So I can kind of see this from both sides. And the thing is, TTOs aren't really supposed to be about value add. They're supposed to be about the most effective allocation of the small, tiny amounts of money they have to translate stuff into the real world. And like the guy said, like the 3 people serving 13,000 researchers at Imperial is fairly ridiculous. But the key to all of it is to go in prepared, so to know what you want out of it. If you can make their life easy, you can very quickly get stuff out of the university and put it into a company. If you're going in with, I've got this thing, I don't really know what to do with it, it's going to sit on the shelf forever. So as much as you can, work with people outside, work with venture investors that really know the field, so you can go in a strong position and just say, I want to do this, how do I get it out? Let's just do this next week, done.
Well, since we're actually, speaking at a college venue, Cooper Union, you might find this very refreshing to hear, but basically all the IP here belongs to the researchers. And so if you want to deal directly with the engineers here, go right ahead with very minimal red tape. So just letting any investor here know that. That might change after I just said this publicly. Okay, well, we're down to about 3 minutes here. We'll open it up to the audience. Any questions out there? I see hands up, so I'm going to pass these mics down to our volunteers.
Just wanted to make one comment, excuse me, when you talked about cholesterol as a surrogate endpoint. I think there's something to be learned, as an example, in the HIV area. When that was an acute issue, late 80s, early 90s, overall survival, I mean, to be crude, a body bag study was the only way to get an HIV drug approved. But through the leadership of the FDA, NIH, and pharma companies coming together, they pooled their information and their data to show that viral load is an appropriate surrogate endpoint for overall survival, which allowed the FDA then to have viral load as a registration endpoint. I'm just looking at this field the way it is now, and it seems like there's a way to understand what's pre-competitive and what's competitive information. And maybe there's a role for companies, very exquisite biotech companies, to pool their information in a pre-competitive type of nature to actually accelerate registration and things like that. Just a comment.
I noticed you referred to it as an HIV drug. They used to be AIDS drugs, and even the whole languaging of it has changed as a result of being able to use that proxy now as whether something is considered a successful intervention or not. HIV antibody titer, for instance, being a proxy. It may be that soon we'll think of drugs not as an anti-aging drug, but as a senescent cell drug, and that'll just start to become standard parlance when we're referring to that particular area. So I like the idea of cooperating and pooling information. Sometimes pharma companies do that. It's really, really hard to get people to do that. So it takes a lot of work, and you have to communicate to them why there's some mutually beneficial outcome that'll happen, and nothing negative will happen to them in the whole process. So it's hats off to you if you can pull off that political magic trick. I just wanted to mention one other alternative to using biomarkers that is kind of like a starting to be tapped secret superpower of the aging biology field, which is the use of proxy conditions. So, for instance, ICOR is going after this condition through SENS for, say, age-related macular degeneration, which is emblematic of a bunch of other aging pathway processes happening, but isn't easy to identify and easy to declare victory on if you have a therapy for it. And I think that not only assembling an arsenal of biomarkers, but also assembling a really clearly defined mapping of a bunch of proxy diseases for various of the aging pathways and sort of hallmarks of aging, if you will, in terms of proxy diseases will also be helpful.
Are you guys looking forward to the day, like, say, celebrities from Hollywood decides to maybe invest a couple $1 million in anti-aging research, and then it makes the news, and then it opens the floodgates for more money to come in, and it the general public gets more informed of it, and then the ramifications of that. You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm quite looking forward to that day, yes. No, I mean, seriously, we've been trying to make that happen for quite a long time. Our main outreach coordinator at Sands is Maria Entriguez. She's lived in Hollywood for 20-odd years. She was a very successful singer-songwriter, and so she has a lot of connections, and she knows how the celebrities think. But even with that inside knowledge, it's been hell on wheels making anything happen. We've had a few isolated examples of reasonably well-known celebrities who've got involved at a low level, like Edward James Olmos, for example, who was the star of Battlestar Galactica, has given us a lot of his time for free, and done voiceovers and videos for us and such like. But there's been very little of that. Probably the only really significant one that's happened so far is Steve Aoki did a benefit for us like a year or two ago. But again, we need far more of this.
Yeah, I want to jump in here too. I too am looking forward to that day, and that's actually one of our long-term goals at Leaf. That's part of the mission of us doing these big videos with YouTube collaborators that are hitting millions of people, is to sort of, in a sense, fish to get people interested, and maybe we'll get an email one day, and we're also actively, working on connections of connections, etc. And I think a really instructive model to look at for this is the progression of cancer advocacy, where it's started in the 40s and 50s, where it was basically just a couple of advocates doing, in a sense, slick PR maneuvers like the Jimmy Fund. People aren't going to get behind curing cancer, this vague, amorphous thing. So let's pick this kid. His real name was Gustav, I think. And they built this, whole initiative around him. Let's save this boy, Jimmy. And they got all this public attention, which eventually radiated out into getting celebrity endorsements and all this kind of stuff. And then once you hit, stand up to cancer level, when you have, baseball games being devoted to it, now you've changed the game. And that's one of our long-term goals, personally. So.
I guess I would only have one thing to add here, which is I think that it's going to be two very different perspectives. If you're talking about advocacy and philanthropy and support for the research, as Aubrey and Keith kind of just got into, versus the investment from the commercial side. So right now, we're investing a little over $50 billion a year in cancer therapeutics, if you count the pharma companies' investment in cancer therapeutics. That's a lot of money. And those players, the pharma companies, and then the kind of engine of money that Ramphis mentioned, which is the family offices that are kind of the funds behind the funds, when these guys are looking for places to put their money, and there's a Time magazine cover of "Will Google Cure Aging?" These guys, they pay attention, right? Longevity in the family office world is in the same category as cryptocurrency right now. It's taking the world of these money behind the money investors by storm. The main question for them is, what the hell do we do about it, right? With this new field, they want to see respectable actors that have a good track record in the space, that have the network of the people who are going to succeed, and then kind of funnel their resources and their bets in the space through them. So I think that they're waiting for validation in the market.
Quick follow-up, you touched on it, but of course it's worth noting that obviously these two things are very interrelated. You could see yourself in a meeting with an investor who is a fan of Steve Aoki and says, "Oh, I heard about that. I've been interested in that." Yeah.
Okay, so let's give a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you.